Graffiti Park by Ken Compton. Her body was pinned to the ground under his girth. Her clothes were torn off. She squirmed against the warm soil, the effort more exhausting than helpful, and cringed as he positioned himself between her thighs. He had threatened to slit her throat if she screamed. What had she learned in self-defense? The practice dummy never attacked, and tucked in the shorts down by her feet, the mace was unreachable. She clenched her teeth to block his slithering tongue, but was capable of nothing else. A beam of sunlight shone through the trees, giving her a lasting glimpse of the devil. White, hair blonde, beard scruffy, eyes brown and beady. She laid her head back and rolled her eyes up to darkness. The pleasure in his face was too awful, and the stench of oysters and whiskey was worthy of vomit. She saw someone. An enormous figure had emerged from the shadows against the trees. He headbutted her and spat. "Stupid bitch!" Her body went numb. She blacked out. Steve Reichert lay spread-eagled and partially awake under a single sheet. The plan was to sleep till noon, but the rumble of his neighbor's '84 Buick had disturbed his dream of winning another set of keys to the city. He fumbled for his watch on the nightstand. 8:34 a.m. The remnant of scotch intensified his morning breath. Being crowned Officer of the Year for the third time at the banquet the night before had made it an occasion for more than a Bud Light. Thank God for the rookies who had escorted him home. A few more drinks, and he would have been bound to the bed with regret throbbing through his cranium. The phone rang. Steve frowned and tapped the speaker button. "This is Reichert." "Rise and shine, shitface!" The chief's voice crackled. "Not quite shitface, chief." He yawned. "What I need this early? Advise on a case or something?" "I need you to come in." Steve winced. "I'm still on vacation." "I need the precinct's best on this one." "What is it?" "A rape and assault about 3 hours ago." "You're calling me in for rape and assault?" "It happened in Graffiti Park." Steve opened his eyes and reached for a fresh pack of Newport. The first smoke of the day was his favorite. "I'm listening." "Dispatch was notified right before dawn. The victim is a 23-year-old Caucasian female, came in through an open gate in the north sector for an early run, and got attacked by an unknown. They searched the area based on her description of the assailant, and the dogs even picked up a scent from a bloody knife found at the scene, but the trail turned cold." Steve took a deep drag. "She must be new in town." "Exactly. Had no clue about the park's reputation." "Where are we with forensics?" "No stab wounds were on the victim, so the blood doesn't appear to be hers, but about 48 hours full of serology." "Any fingerprints on the knife?" "No good for a match." "You're not giving me a lot to start with, Chief." "You've solved more with less, Lumbo." His case-solving ability had earned him that nickname. He was less intuitive than Sherlock Holmes, but more empirical than Columbo, at least according to his own assessment. "All right, I'll be there as soon as I can." "There's one more thing. The girl saw somebody before blacking out, and we suspect this person contacted dispatch." "You suspect?" "What was on the call trace?" Silence lingered. "There was no call trace." Wait. Steve threw his legs over the bedside. "A call came into dispatch, but there was nothing to trace?" "No phone number registered in the call log, but a voice resonated in the dispatch office and said a rape victim would be found in the north sector. The officers sent up a troll to follow protocol, and you know the rest." Steve pulled the cigarette to his lips, but the scar on his lower leg ignited with an itch. A thought solidified into relief while he scratched. "Hey, Chief?" He leaned forward to the speakerphone. "What did this voice sound like?" "According to dispatch, it sounded like an old Irish woman." Holy shit, Steve thought and jumped up. "I need to see the crime scene for myself." "Why all of a sudden? You have a lead on this Irish woman?" "Not at all." He lied. "My instinct is telling me to go to the park to check things out first." "I know you'd rather work alone, but let me have some uniforms meet you at the main entrance." "They'll only distract me."
Only a fool would go there with no backup. Plus, there's a heat advisory today.
You're assigning me for a reason, Chief, so let me do it my way. Another moment of silence.
Crime scene cordoned off the area by the runner's trail in the north sector. Watch yourself and call if you find anything ASAP. That's an order, Steve. I'm on it.
The curtains were drawn, but the adjacent hallway light lit the smoky room adequately. Steve looked down the hall at Bane, his Doberman, who was still asleep on the doggy bed. He paced in the bedroom, searching for logic in the impossible and thumping ashes in an empty pickle jar with each pass around the king-sized sleigh bed. The old Irish woman must be 200 years old by now. He lifted his leg onto an ottoman. The scar had not bothered him since that night years ago. Why now? Steve bit his lower lip, his eyes drifting to the 5.7 portrait of himself as a 6-year-old standing in front of his parents, their faces cut out. The day's finest smoke curled away in the air. After one final deep drag, he shut down any lingering thoughts. Still wet from the shower, his shirt felt plastered around the top of his broad back. He fed Bane and let him out, yet skipped his toasted bagel and Sumatra blend, choosing a jumbo pickle and vitamin water instead. A quick self-check for keys, wallet, badge, Glock, iPhone, and he was out the door. While waiting at a red light, he tilted back onto the headrest in his new Ford Expedition and thought about Graffiti Park. News networks and reality shows from Ripley's to Unsolved Mysteries had featured stories about this place. Years ago, dozens of human skeletons had been discovered there buried from the neck down, the skulls serving as headstones for the gang members who had clashed on the park grounds. The only survivor had been hospitalized with decayed skin hanging upon brittle bone.
She made the ground swallow us! She made the ground swallow us!
He had never recovered from shock. A young murderer convict had escaped police custody and been hiding in the park. Days later, an elderly gentleman was discovered, claiming to be the culprit. Fingerprints proved that the old man and the convict were the same person. More recently, hundreds of people had gathered in the east sector for a bonfire despite a city ordinance outlawing such an event. Rain doused every attempt to create the flame, or so it had seemed. All attendees were stricken with pneumonia, and the death of those who had planned the event was equally strange. Though skepticism shrouded these accounts, one phenomenon could never be refuted. The mural wall, a stone block standing 20 feet high and stretching an eighth of a mile long, stood as graffiti's central mystery. The portraits, from which the park earned its name, was ever-changing. Holocaust, 9/11, and the Hindenburg disaster displayed previously. The pictures were more thrilling than 3D, but who or what was changing the wall remained unknown. Some believe the paintings predicted the future. During the 1960s, a mural of a black man lying dead on a balcony appeared. A week later, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered while standing on the second floor outside his motel room. Nonetheless, the mural wall was a part of graffiti as much as the park was part of the city. There had been attempts to turn the landmark into a residential area. Still, despite petitions and the support of city officials, all efforts failed for obscure reasons. For the last several years, the entrances had been barricaded with caution tape and the park remained officially closed. Steve arrived at the park's main entrance and removed the barriers in front of a large, rusted wrought iron gate. Gargoyle sentries on both sides ushered the way to hell, so it seemed, as he drove a spiraling road at 25 miles per hour. Easy listening faded to static on the radio. Changing the station and adjusting the volume did not help. On impulse, he pressed the power on his iPhone, but it was dead too. His stomach knotted like a mass of maggots squirming in his gut. The better idea of leaving eased the sudden sickness. But the SUV accelerated to 35, 50, and 70 miles per hour. The radio blasted Beyoncé and Bach. He grabbed the wheel and slammed the brakes. The expedition ignored his every maneuver. The doors locked, and the car sped up a hill, forcing him back against the seat while rocks pelted the underside and the smoke from the hood clouded the windshield. The truck jumped a hilltop and slammed onto the ground. The seatbelt cut across his waist and shoulder. The scar skidded and sped faster. He gritted his teeth and scrunched down. His breathing was heavy and sweat stung his eyes. A small incline, a sharp right turn, a veer to the left, and a sudden dip. His stomach dropped and his sides ached. The vehicle turned again, but the speed decreased. The music faded. The smoke stopped. The windshield cleared. The car coasted to a stop next to a sign that read North Sector. The engine shut off and the doors unlocked. Steve darted out, pulled the Glock, and aimed in all directions. Okay, he thought wildly.
Okay, I'm here.
His voice echoed as he remained poised for a reason to open fire, a 360 turn with knees bent and back straight. The trees, the grass, the air, everything was a threat. He had never killed anyone in his 24-year career as a cop. Would today be the day? A quick turn toward the SUV, aiming as if the car was a criminal. He maneuvered around the truck, astonished. No broken lights, no loose mirrors, no worn tire threads, no visible damage. Yet the engine refused to start with key fob, and after what he had been through, no way he would try the manual ignition. The iPhone had fallen onto the floor mat. It was still dead. Shit. A second attempt with a key fob failed. He would not be allowed to leave even if the car did start, he thought. Sunbeams roasted his head while pondering the predicament. The runner's trail was yards away. Another scan of the area offered no other option. What the hell have I gotten myself into? Steve wiped his face with a rough forearm, kneeled to tighten the shoelaces on his Nikes, and started walking. Except for his shoes thumping the ground, there was no sound. No birds chirped, no wind bristled. The trees on either side of the path stood like chess pieces planted strategically for battle. A robin's nest hung on a low branch ahead. A mother and 3 babies sat inside. The everyday activity of a busy bird tending to open beaks was absent. Instead, 4 birds sat almost inert, their heads turned slowly while he walked by. Steve paused for something more characteristic, yet each bird lifted its left wing as if granting his passage. On the open acres, seedy grass surrounded a small pond filled with dark, sulfur-stinking water. Spiderwebs engulfed an odious outhouse. Dry, rotted picnic tables, shoddy sandboxes, broken swings, and a lopsided jungle gym had deteriorated the area. Steve approached the tunnel of forestation where 12-foot-tall bushes stood alongside trees with low-hanging branches blocking most sunlight. Although dark places never scared him, his courage level was lower than usual at the opening of what appeared to be the park's mouth and throat. The dank cavern emanated a stench upon entering. His nerve diminished once the light from the entrance faded. The specks of sunlight filtering through the crevices formed shapes above him. A colossal crucifix nearly coerced him to confess sins and repent. Steve walked farther and saw another shape, a giant eyeball staring down. He squinted. The single eye had morphed into dozens. He ran toward the entrance, but the tree limbs came to life and lashed across the pathway. Branches slithered from the opposite direction and bound his legs and arms, paralyzing him like tentacles. Steve kicked and screamed, but the restraints tightened his torso. The limbs stretched toward his face and bore into his mouth and eyelids, forcing his mouth wide and eyes open. A ball of light materialized from the far end of the tunnel and paneled into a flat screen. Scenes from his past unfolded before him. His mother's infidelities, his father's drug use, and himself as a child hiding under the bed while his parents fought. The light flickered. The courtroom, the judge, the custody hearings, the memories flooded back as his anger rose to a fever pitch. The light flickered again. The molestation from his mother, the beatings from his father. The tunnel went dark, and the vines released their grip. He fell to the ground, limp. After stumbling to his feet, he scrambled to the tunnel's end, toward the caution tape that was just beyond. Steve staggered to the crime scene and vomited. After the dry heaves, he wiped his mouth and touched his face. No blood, no pain. An oak tree gave support for him to lean against. Shake it off. It was a long time ago. To hell with them anyway. His pride would take a hit if anyone saw him like this. A nervous hand yanked a pack of Newport from his pocket. The cigarette took the extra effort to light, but the smoke filling his lungs was more welcome than oxygen. He exhaled. The uneasiness settled as the smoke dissipated, yet questions ricocheted like billiard balls at the break. When did this become about me? And why now? Here. He appreciated Graffiti's silence for the first time, closing his eyes and trying to imagine a better start to the day. By the end of the cigarette, he felt more like himself. Steve dropped the butt and rested against the tree with closed eyes. "Pick it up, Stephen." Steve drew the Glock, but a crushing blow knocked him down and sent the gun flying. At the sight of what stood before him, he struggled to regain footing. Silver hair rippled from under a black skull cap. Her skin was ghostly white and cracked like chirp paint. Wide green eyes contrasted with a small nose and tiny lips. A long black wool coat swallowed her thin frame, despite the blistering summer heat, as enormous hands clutched a tattered purple bag in front. She was not alone. 8 white-tailed bucks with 3-foot horns stood alongside her. An equal number of gray wolves appeared, baring their teeth and growling. Dozens of raccoons and opossums clung to the tree barks, while flocks of owls and ospreys swooped onto available branches. Rabbits, moles, and mice scurried in a massive furry motion. The park came alive with the uproar of howls and screeches until the old woman lifted a single thick finger. All was silent. All floated to him. "Pick it up, Stephen. There be no fire started in this here park." Steve stood, and even at 6'4", he was about 2 feet shorter than the woman. She hovered just above the ground. He stamped the cigarette butt before picking it up and shoved it into his pocket. My, Stephen. He has grown into quite a man. Tall and broad-shouldered. No longer a runt of a boy. Steve stared, unable to speak. He cleared his throat and threw his shoulders back. "I need your help." "You're searching for that perverted fool of a man, ye are. We need to apprehend him before he hurts someone else. There'll be more for ye to figure out here, Stephen." He squinted. "What do you mean?" "You've forgotten what I taught ye years ago." Steve maintained eye contact, yet his mind drifted. He felt 7 years old again, running through Graffiti Park the night he learned that his parents would be getting a divorce. In his haste, he had fallen and cut his leg. Then she appeared. "Hello, Stephen." "Who are you?" "Someone who knows that you ran away from home." "I hate that place. All they do is fight and scream." "Running away is never the answer, Stephen. Somehow, I believe they love ye, even with their troubles." "What's going to happen to me?" "That I cannot answer. Only time will tell." She pointed at the cut on his leg. "Let's have a look at that." She pulled a handkerchief from her purple bag and dabbed at the blood. She covered the wound with her heavy hand, tilted her head and muttered, "Mayung din, mayung din, mayung din, may, mayung din, mayung din." Her eyes batted and her hand glowed green. He gritted his teeth under the might of her grip until the chanting stopped. She released him and hovered above. "Go home now, Stephen. Whatever happens, do not hold any anger towards your mother and father. Hate will poison your soul and make you do evil deeds. And evil deeds are always punished, Stephen." Young Stephen had run. He looked over his shoulder and saw her standing at the hilltop. A second wind propelled him through the park's entrance and across the side street. He turned once more and saw the old woman posted at the gate. He ran without looking back again. Although he could not see her, he felt as if she was watching him. The cut had healed by the time he was home, but it had left a scar on his leg. He had received a merciless beating from both parents. Steve shook his head. That was a long time ago, and this isn't about me. This is more about ye than ye can imagine. And don't concern yourself over that nasty man who raped that poor girl. That nasty man is still out there. Evil deeds are still punished, Stephen. A grin curved her lips, yet there was no humor in her tone. You know where he is, don't you? She said nothing, but the grin remained. He lowered his head and chose his next words carefully. All I'm asking is for some clue. But the old woman and the animals had vanished. Steve suddenly felt alone, without anyone to whom he could appeal for help. It was just after 1:00 p.m. when he arrived at the precinct and headed to the chief's office to brief him with some rehearsed story. He hated lying to Zick, since being rookies on the force, but what choice did he have? At his cubicle, Steve studied the artist's rendering of the suspect from the case file the chief had given him. The brown, round eyes exuded menace, like a rattler poised to strike. Although rapists rarely change their appearance, Steve pictured the pervert with different hair color and a clean-shaven face, but those eyes would belie any alteration. Some details about the victim. Terry Carter, a recent college graduate, had spent most of her life in Boise, Idaho. Steve thought of questions he could ask and made some notes in the file. He spoke to the psychologist at the victim's unit and waited while a nurse prepared Terry for another official visit. After a few moments, he walked in and stopped short. Steve had seen countless victims, yet the viciousness of this attack brought such sadness, he struggled to fight back tears. Steve introduced himself and expressed his sympathies. An acknowledgement of her bravery in repeating the horrific event served as an empowering tactic. The effort to capture the perpetrator would be as successful as cooperation allowed. Terry recounted the details. His bug-eyed look, his whiskey fish breath, his raspy grunts, his painful thrust inside of her. Steve visualized the crime scene and placed himself in her position, looking up onto the face of the rapist. He envisioned the old woman. What had she done during the assault? What about the blood on the knife? Who had been cut? Was there another victim? After nearly an hour, he found himself with more questions than answers, but questions paved the way toward leads, the first rule in his work. He gathered as much as he could from Terry's account and promised that the attacker would be caught and punished to the fullest. The follow-up started with comparing the sketch to images of known sex offenders. It continued with scrutinization of nearby store surveillance of patrons buying alcohol. He leaned on forensics to expedite the DNA analysis and personally examine the knife. Was it new or old? Cheap or expensive? The first day of the investigation was the most important. To his disappointment, he obtained nothing from his effort. The next step would be to post the sketch on the evening news and wait for potential leads. By the end of the workday, he had chain-smoked nearly 2 full packs of Newport. A long night awaited him, he suspected, as Terry's appearance screwed with his emotions. He usually remained detached, but if he had a daughter, she would be about the same age. In the precinct's parking lot, Steve gripped the steering wheel, glaring through the window, replaying the events of the day. The assault, the audio clairvoyance to dispatch, the crazy car ride, the shit in the tunnel, the old woman's appearance and her disappearance. What had she meant about him having more to figure out? Nothing made sense. The possibility of quickly closing the case faded like a beacon light in the corner of his mind. The iPhone beeped with a text. Bud Light Platinum on tap at 30 Dogs B&G. Come on through, Sherlumbo. He could go for a beer and double cheeseburger with extra pickles, but he dismissed the text. If this case was unresolved, Steve froze. He reread the text, and a question burned into thought. Something that he did not ask the chief that morning, but needed to answer now. A text message to Zick avoided a lengthy phone conversation over a question that could lead to everything or to nothing. The chief's response confirmed a suspicion. Steve revved the engine as fast as adrenaline surged with renewed hope. Daylight was burning. No time to tell anyone or do much else. He had to return to Graffiti Park. In the west sector, derelict dugouts and bird-shitted bleachers were all that remained of an abandoned baseball field. Upon exiting the vehicle, the record-high heat burned Steve's face, and, as he trekked the diamond, the seemingly scorching sand infested with scorpions compounded the uninvite. Before long, his khakis were stuck to his legs and polo was soaked at the armpits. He loosened the buttons and pressed on against the humid air. The need for shade accelerated his movement toward the trees in the distance. Still, the faster he walked, the farther away the trees appeared to be. Sunbeams seared him and sweat dripped from his chin. His pace slowed to a plod once he reached the grass. His head spun and vision blurred, mouth hung open, bone dry. Panting, he trudged a few more feet before collapsing and blacking out. The sun was gone when Steve awoke. A hacking cough forced him to clutch his chest and jettison the grittiness. Confusion weighed heavily, yet a replay of the events that had led him here settled uncertainty with regret. More coughing followed a deep breath. He struggled to rise and glance at what little was visible. The moon shone full and blue. High above, the tree branches were like black paint splattered against the illuminated clouds. Darkness shrouded all else. Returning tomorrow seemed like a better plan, but a vision of Terry flashed and reminded him of his promise to her. Steve clenched his teeth and pulled the Glock. No turning back. Along the field's edge, he paced, ready for anything. Trees sheltered the pathway, and the full moon appeared in shards through the branches. Pinpricks of light blinked all about. A twig crackled here and there. Wings flapped overhead. He heard scampering in the bush, and something nearby hissed. Steve tightened his gun grip and kept walking. From behind, a heavy thud announced an arrival. Steve turned and met menacing orange eyes surrounded by a shaggy face, short snout, and jagged teeth. The thing lowered its head and growled. He pointed the Glock, yet anxiety quadrupled when 3 more sets of orange eyes opened and glowed in the night. Steve stepped back. They moved forward as a bead of sweat trickled his face. He had to stand his ground. 12 feet decreased to 10, with their eyes conveying bloodthirst. Where is the old woman now? He swallowed hard. 8 feet. They were twice as big as Bane. 6 feet. The savagery stank upon them. Fuck it. He fired 4 shots. Gunsmoke drifted from the gun barrel as the wolves lay wounded, moaning in agony. Steve sighed. If they are meant to live, the old woman can heal them, he thought. The moon appeared at a clearing. The openness eased apprehension, yet Steve remained vigilant, the gun still warm in his hand. Gravel replaced the dirt on the path, a sign that he was getting close to it. He braced himself for whatever he was about to see and thought for a moment. During the early phone call, Chief Zick indicated that the dogs had picked up a scent at the crime scene, but the trail had turned cold. Steve had neglected to ask where the search ended. The air cooled and the moon brightened, yet all was silent as Steve approached the mural wall. Yet goosebumps prickled on his thighs, and the hair all over his body bristled. Perspiration on his forehead, back, and feet exacerbated the uneasiness as the full length of the wall came into view. The brown mineral was ancient, massive, and imposing. He wondered if it had been expecting him. However, the mural wall was blank, an empty canvas. Steve rubbed his forehead, disheartened. The air became cooler with each step toward the center. His face, arms, and hands were frigid. Numb fingertips and visible breath soon followed. Thunder roared and lightning struck the mural. The ground trembled. He fell back, covered his head, and curled into a fetal position as fear intensified. Something had to be done, but what? The wall could topple, or the ground could open. Lightning struck the wall again. The ground gyrated mercilessly. He pictured his tombstone. Questions swirled in what he thought would be his final moments. Who would capture the attacker? Was the old woman responsible for this? What was my sin to deserve this? The chaos lasted a minute that felt like a month. The thunder ceased. The lightning ended. The earthquake stopped. He lay still, covering his head and gnashing his teeth. The feeling returned to his fingers, yet his hands were sweaty. After a few moments, he stood and checked himself for injuries. Dumbest idea yet, Sherlumbo. Steve chided himself before turning to leave. An odor pierced his nostrils, a stink of Jim Beam and rotten fish. He covered his nose and mouth and searched for the source. What the hell? A white, chalky outline had emerged on the mural. The figure held its hands out, as if pushing from the opposite side of the rock. Within the odd silhouette, the surface melted and boiled like fillings in a cauldron. Color brightened, and the shape solidified into white skin, blonde hair, scraggly beard, and brown beady eyes. Steve glared. Something about the image seemed more real than imaginary. He moved closer to touch the face. It felt warm and cold, soft and hard, a mixture of flesh and stone beneath his fingertips. Moisture streamed from its eyes, and a red substance dripped from its crotch. "Please, help me have mercy, mercy," said a small voice nearby. Steve saw no one. He thought for a moment and reached for his wallet. A business card sufficed to dab the fluids. A DNA comparison to the blood on the knife would seal the case, yet no way could he explain any of this. Too many questions remained. Had the old woman intervened during the assault, disarmed the rapist, and stabbed his crotch before hauling him here? Was the rapist alive, dead, trapped between hell and purgatory, or imprisoned forever within the mural wall? Steve was confident, however, that the son of a bitch would never harm anyone again. The scar tingled. He bent down and rubbed the keloid length of the cut through the pant leg as the old woman's voice about his parents echoed in memory. "Do not hold any hate. It will poison your soul and make you do evil deeds." His father was dying of cancer in a retirement home in the east part of town. His mother showed signs of dementia, residing alone in the house they all once shared. He had kept tabs on them for selfish reasons, but had not seen either one in years. Biting his lower lip and gazing about to avoid the guilt proved useless. His focus fell again upon the wall, and the terror on the face of its prisoner urged Steve to think of his own fate should his anger ever get the best of him. Who am I really hurting? Tomorrow, I'll go visit my parents. He was not ready to forgive and forget, but seeing them was a start. At least, not for their sake, but his own. A peace settled in. A feeling he had never experienced and did not want to interrupt by overthinking it. Only one concern remained. What justice would there be for Terry with a case that would never be closed officially? He lit the last Newport, took a drag, and blew the smoke toward a starless sky. The dark surroundings felt less ominous. In fact, he wondered about all he had been through during the day, being forced to face old hurts, but learning much about his own resilience. The place of persecution had been the place of salvation, or at least the beginning of it. Perhaps the same would happen for Terry. He could justify her return to the park as part of the investigation. It was worth a chance, he thought. And what about this fucker? A final gaze at the mural wall's prisoner as the tears and blood poured and the tiny voice pleaded. Steve took another drag, exhaled the smoke into the portrait's face, and heard a faint cough. He turned to leave Graffiti Park. A scream rang out. Steve looked back. The mural wall was blank once more.
And as always, please be sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more awesome stories.